The Boris Dirk Podcast, part 2 of NBA Swingers. We've made it east. We're starting from the bottom, Drake style, worst team in the East to the best team in the East, talking guys that we think impact most each team's current objective, whether that's win now, build for the future, etc. You know the drill from our last episode we dropped yesterday. Max, let's get into it.
All right, let's do it. So, starting at the bottom of the East with Charlotte, there are a few different ways you could have gone here. I mean, LaMelo is very key to their future development. He might be the obvious pick. I wanted to go a little off the radar, so I said Mark Williams. He was my favorite center in the draft besides Chet last year, and I kind of see him as like that Jared Allen, Mitchell Robinson prototype, but maybe even with a little bit more upside. I mean, his measurables are insane. His wingspan, his standing reach are like Gobert-esque. And in college, he just had insane feel for blocking shots and being a rim protector. As a prospect, I liked him a lot more than I liked Lively this year. And Lively was pretty heavily touted. So I really see him, I think, as having a pretty high upside as a rim protector and still has a chance to be one of the better centers from that draft. So you could go LaMelo, you could go Brandon Ingram. I guess you could go Miles Bridges too. But does anyone jump out from Charlotte for you?
Yes. For Charlotte, I just chose LaMelo. And I chose LaMelo because I agree with you. Mark Jackson has a sneaky ceiling as like a long-term starter. And I liked him too, almost as much as you, but not quite. LaMelo, I just want to know if he's a winning player because I'm 99% sure he isn't. And he's now got the money. And this is like, I feel like this is the last year. I think most of the world is sort of out on Trae Young now. We crossed that threshold. Maybe not because he did some things in the Celtics series. The Celtics needed 6 to put away Atlanta, and Trae had a lot to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there's a Trae redemption tour on the way. But LaMelo is 1 year away from firmly establishing himself in that Trae bucket of guys that can be the best watch in the NBA, but nobody takes seriously as the the leader of a contender. So I want to watch LaMelo a lot this year, and try to figure out once and for all who this guy can be, because I'm pretty certain Brandon Miller is not the best player on a really on a young core with the potential to do real damage.
Yeah.
I think you're being unrealistic if you put Brandon Miller in that category. Not that you do, but I've been saying through the whole draft process that I think he's closer to Chris Middleton than like an apex swing.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And yeah, I mean, if LaMelo is not a hit for them, then they're kind of back at square one. So that is really the deciding factor, but I went a little off the board. All right, up next, I believe, is Detroit. And once again, this is kind of an obvious one. I went with Cade Cunningham. If he hits the potential that he was drafted with, and you and many others think he has the potential to hit, I do as well, and stays healthy, they're set for the future. They have their future All-NBA player. And if it's another year like the last two, where it's kind of injury riddled or inefficient, or he's showing flashes, but he's not quite getting to that real kind of, pushing into the all-star conversation, all-NBA conversation type of level, then they're kind of they might be back in a pretty dark spot. And they honestly might have the biggest range in how I feel about their future, just depending on how this year goes. Because if Cade is like the centerpiece, I love the pieces they have around him between Ivy and Asar and Duren as well. But if Cade is not good enough to be that centerpiece, I don't think anyone else on the roster has a chance to be. So it really is kind of all riding on him with what their future is going to look like.
Yeah. With LaMelo, he's had injury concerns recently, but for me, with him, it's less about the injuries, even though they're there, and more about, like, does he have winning DNA? With Cade, I have none of those questions. So I'm going to leave Cade out of this because I think that's just an injury question for me. If he's healthy, put him right there in like the Wemby and Zion category of future many-time All-Stars. That's where I'm at with Cade. So I chose Beef Stew. Isaiah Stewart. Not only beef stew, but this is the year that I want the Pistons. If I'm a Pistons fan, I want them to find out if they can play Isaiah Stewart and Jalen Duren together. Because I think both of those guys are going to be really good players for a long time. I've been rewatching a little bit of Isaiah Stewart, and I think that I underestimated how much he's already shown on defense.
Yeah.
And I don't think he's going to be like an above average rim protector ever, but I think he really cares and he moves well for his size. He might be like more switchable than he is like a layup dunk stopper at the rim. So yeah, I think I want them to find out as early as possible if they can play those two guys together and be successful, or if it's just a matchup nightmare against most athletic, fast NBA athletes. So, yeah, and I think they're going to try it because I think both of those guys were productive enough last year that they've commanded 30 plus minutes a game this year.
Yeah. No, I mean, they definitely have a really interesting season coming up. When they come to town to play the Warriors, I'm definitely going to go. I know we have a couple Stones fans listening, so shout out to you guys. But yeah, moving on to Washington. The Wizards might be the blankest slate in the league of any team.
Yeah.
Um, their roster is pretty barren. I just put down Bilal Coulibaly because if you can just see flashes that he has star upside, that's kind of all you really want out of this season. I mean, you can make an argument. Can Jordan Poole get back on track to, how he was playing a couple years ago? But the roster is pretty much a blank slate. It's really just a multi-year tank job that they're starting in on now. And Koulibaly does have that sort of mold of a kind of really high upside swing pick where he's 6'8", 7'2" wingspan, good ball handling skills, and he's basically just like a raw ball of clay. Like when I was doing my draft guide, I had a really hard time coming up with comparisons for him just because you were projecting based on these tiny little flashes. But the combination of feel athleticism and defensive ability with his handle is extremely intriguing.
Yeah. My first instinct with this team, and it might have been yours too, is can they rehabilitate Jordan Poole's image? Can they can they make him the guy that we thought he was going to be a couple of years ago?
Yeah.
Because peak Jordan Poole is still really special. My guess is no. I don't think that you can unteach the softness we've seen from him in the playoffs, defensively. My gut is telling me that Jordan Poole is like a slightly more talented D'Lo type guy.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk a little bit about Denny Avdia.
Okay.
I think his defense is a little bit underrecognized because he's white and he plays for the Wizards. And as he should be. Yeah, and I think he's going to be a good litmus test for their season because he hasn't quite been able to take on the offensive load to make him like a real engine core piece of the future. But he's a really well-rounded player. He's a solid defender, good passer, keeps the ball moving, decent rebounder. His shot comes on and off, and I feel like the Wizards are going to have to trade him soon. If like they need more years to put a successful core together
Yeah.
because he's the kind of guy who's like ready to play significant minutes in the playoffs, I think, because of all the guys he can guard and how hard he plays. So he's a guy I'm looking at on the Wizards, and I would be trying to poach if I were a better team.
Very fair. All right, Orlando. I think we're gonna say the same guy for this one. Jalen Suggs.
Yes, sir.
He from February on last year actually shot 38% from three. So if he can maintain that coming into this season and really develop into that reliable, like at least passable 3-point shooter with absolutely elite defense because he has that insane defensive ability at the off guard position, sort of turn into that like Marcus Smart type off guard for Orlando. That's huge for them because I feel like I know what I have, or I know what they have in Fultz, Wagner, Paolo, and Wendell, at least for this year. Like I think I know what those four guys are going to do to varying degrees. But Suggs has a chance to really raise their ceiling if he hits.
For sure. Suggs all the way. And I'm actually a little bit worried about how much I love Suggs and Anthony Black because at least in the early going, it might not be a perfect fit. I tend to think like genius basketball players slash high level competitors. I think Ant Black being more of like the genius basketball mind and Jalen being more of just a dog that you want guarding really talented guards and small wings.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just tend to think you can put those guys on the floor together and they'll figure it out. But if Suggs hits one of his cold shooting streaks like he's tended to do early in his career, and Ant Black needs a couple of years to become even an acceptable shooter, that fit could be difficult. And that scares me because I would absolutely love to have both those guys on my roster just as the talents they are.
Yeah, and this is almost like I don't want to say like it's all riding on this season, but as much as he's a swing guy for the Magic, this is almost kind of like a swing season for him where if like the Magic are really trying to compete this year, they're trying to push for a playoff or play-in spot, and he's probably not going to have as long of a leash if the shooting's really cold. Like they're going to put in Gary Harris or give Jed Howard a shot or whoever if they just want to get a little bit more shooting on the court because that's really their biggest flaw right now. But yeah, I'm very
Yeah.
curious to see what he looks like this year. He's dealt with some injuries as well over his first couple seasons, so I want to see if he can kind of just settle in a little bit more.
Yeah. And show us this offensive ceiling that you were drafted fifth for.
Yeah.
Because it's great if he turns into Marcus Smart. That's a great career, but they
Mm-hmm.
didn't draft him to be Marcus Smart.
Right.
They drafted him to average closer to 20 points a game, not 10. And he's looked just limited because the shot has taken time. And he's not big enough to dominate in the paint. A guy like SGA can stop shooting threes and still get to the free throw line. Jalen Suggs doesn't have that luxury. So I hope his shooting stroke is there this year.
Right. They drafted him to be Drew Holiday, not Marcus Smart.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to Indiana. So we touched on them a couple episodes ago when we were talking about what a successful season would look like for them. And I just kept coming back to Benedict Mathurin. He's probably he's their highest ceiling young player besides Halliburton, because I think Halliburton's pretty established at this point as one of the top guards in the league, one of the top lead decision makers in the league. But Mathurin, of all the guys on their team, is the leading contender for like, can someone be a second stud next to Halliburton? I really liked him coming out of college. I think I had him fifth on my board. I think you had him around the same spot. My comps for him coming out were Wiggins, Wes Matthews, and Oladipo, like depending on the degree to which the scoring translated. Clearly the scoring is translated. The defense has not translated to the same degree for all those three comps. So curious to see if he can kind of regain that defensive tenacity. And I don't think he'll ever be a good playmaker, but can he at least like try or be okay? Just sort of look like he thinks about passing from time to time. Because if he does, and he can be more than just like a volume scorer, that does significantly raise their ceiling going forward.
I'm with you. Mathurin is the most sensical name here. I had him at 7 in his draft after Jeremy Sohan. What up?
Uh-huh.
But just for fun, let me, say a couple sentences on Andrew Nemhard because
Mm-hmm.
Nemhard is nothing like Fred VanVleet, but he reminds me of VanVleet's rise in the way that I really wrote him off as a college player. Like I don't even think I looked at Nemhard in his draft really. I was like, oh, everyone has him in like somewhere between 40 and 60, and I'm just okay. Van Vliet, the same at Wichita State, and suddenly he gets to the league and at his size is able to do things I had no idea he was capable of doing. I'm fascinated by Nemhard's game because of how stout he is defensively, despite his height. And he's significantly bigger and broader shoulders than Fred Van Vliet, as
Yep.
chunky as Fred is in the right ways. Yeah, so I want to know the same way I want to know if Beef Stew can play with Duran. I want to know if Halliburton and Nemhard can coexist, and Mathurin is in that bag too. Like, who are the 2 or 3 backcourt guys that you're riding and dying with? We know Bruce can play some 3, some 4. Bruce Brown will fit in. He's a Swiss Army knife. But Mathurin and Nemhard are the guys that I'm excited to track, like just how they coexist with Halliburton, who has to be the guy when it matters.
Yeah. I mean, the collective IQ between Nemhard and Halliburton is so high. I feel like they can
Exactly.
figure it out, at least
And
offensively.
it's hard for me to imagine, unless Mathurin takes a huge step as a decision maker defender, that Carlisle doesn't want to ride with those 2 like heady point guards late in
Yep.
game.
All right. On to Chicago. This is one where I thought about it for a while. You could go, I mean, DeRozan, Levine are their best players. Vucevic. I just came back to their GM, Arturas Karnisovas. I feel like he's the swing factor here. It's just time to blow this thing up. Like they're going all in for the 8th seed. We saw where that got Washington, like just trading Bradley Beal for pennies on the dollar, when tanking way too late, where you're now tanking in a draft that everyone agrees is like a bad draft as opposed to doing it for this year. And I say just trade DeMar and Levine while you can still get something for them. This Lonzo situation is so sad, especially like as someone, I mean, I haven't gone through like nearly any of the stuff that Lonzo's go through, but like just going through one knee surgery is bad enough. Like having to go through like three or however many he's gone through and still not be close to getting back on the basketball court, I just can't even imagine. And they just extended Vucevic for some reason. Like they gave him an above market deal. And
Did you make a corny Instagram story in high school telling people that your knee was going to be okay?
no, I never had surgery in high school, but yeah.
And Stephen A was staying out of your business.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
didn't like the video, but I do like that he wants to set the record straight because the court of public opinion can be cruel. And but also like, what's the point of saying anything when you've been out as long as Lonzo? Like, obviously the fans are going to believe it when they see it.
Yeah.
I hear you on the GM. Pat Williams feels like a Zach Lowe take, but like we all know, Pat Williams has a lot of potential still. He was like the youngest guy in his draft. He's still so young. What is he? 22, probably
Yeah.
something like that.
Hmm.
So I think that it would be foolish to say like a Pat Williams breakout is out of the cards. It could still happen. And I think he's the trade piece that I'm most intrigued by on that roster right now. But shout out Dalen Terry, whom I had, I think, 13 in his draft. And then I was flabbergasted that he went like 16. I thought I was like incredibly high, but I had him at 13. So my team would have gotten him.
Hmm.
And yeah, massive, like 8'10" standing reach, has like the length of an NBA four, but his shot just is on again, off again. I feel like his jump shot looks a little bit different each season, which scares the shit out of me.
Yeah.
And but he's one of those guys who can kind of do everything else. Great passer, really cares on defense. And yeah, I think he's a little bit like he's got a little bit of like 6'9" Jalen Suggs type vibe. He's just a winning player who plays hard. And yeah, maybe his ceiling is higher than we realize because he's been playing underneath some really high usage offensive stars.
Very fair. But yeah, Chicago, maybe go for it one more year, but please don't keep this thing going past 2025. Like tank for Cooper
Yeah.
Flag or something.
But and if you go for and please don't trade like Pat Williams or Dalen Terry, to like
Yeah.
try to fix things. So, that's like the classic Bill Simmons, like having a kid to save the marriage. Like you have a couple intriguing young guys. Julian Phillips, don't forget him. He's definitely
Hmm.
not the swing player this year, but another young guy that I would like the Blazers to have at least.
All right, moving on to Toronto. Once again, I'm dipping into the lost footage of the 2021 redraft. Scotty Barnes, that top five, once again, just they're all entering pivotal years, whether it's Suggs, Barnes, Cunningham, Mobley, or Jalen Green. But Scotty Barnes' development kind of dictates if the Raptors have a cornerstone or if they're just kind of stuck in purgatory. Seems like they may try trade Pascal, but also seems like maybe not. And if they don't, then how long is Masai going to stick with this roster construction of a bunch of guys who are long but can't shoot? Because it's just led to some pretty hard watch basketball over the last couple years. But if Scotty Barnes kind of regains that look that he had in his rookie season, where he's looks like a future all-star and he was untouchable in Kevin Durant trade talks and all of that, then they're in a good spot. And if he regresses, the jumper shows no improvement. If it's sort of like a Ben Simmons situation where he looks really impressive as a rookie, but then just kind of looks like the same player each of the next few years, then they're kind of stuck. So he's really the key to their whole rebuild.
Yeah. And I think Scotty Barnes has a chance to be a really interesting case study on like the AAU generation. Sam Vecini did this super interesting conversation recently on his podcast just about the way like we see like a really big athletic guy with ball skills and we do everything we can to turn them into like a Ben Simmons, a 6'8" point guard.
Yep.
Some guys are such good passers and have such high IQs like Josh Giddey that maybe it's worth it. But maybe we delayed Scotty Barnes's growth by trying to talk ourselves into the idea of him as a point guard. Maybe he needs to really hone in on his off ball skills, and not even necessarily catch and shoot game, but just like everything, every part of the game that doesn't include the ball in his hands. And I'm with you there. I mean, I love everything I've seen from Dennis Schroeder, but he's not their swing piece.
Mm-mm.
I'm talking Dennis Schroeder for Germany. We've got Jakob Pertl, poor man's Walker Kessler, and yeah, but it's gotta be Scotty, because I think there are other best players like Pascal. Like Pascal's just been delivering year after year. I feel like we know who he is, and
Yep.
OG, we know who he is. Scotty's the guy we don't quite understand yet, and he is objectively Toronto's swing piece.
Yes. All right, now we're getting into the playoff teams in the East from last year. Speaking of Pascal Siakam trade rumors, Atlanta's been a team that's long rumored for him. And my swing factor for them is basically the rumored trade package, which is the wing trio of DeAndre Hunter, AJ Griffin, and Jalen Johnson. Just like, are any of them going to pop this year?
Yeah.
Uh, I think they're set at guard. I don't necessarily love the Trey and DeJounte fit, but like that's what they have, and they're locked into it for the next several years. And at big, both Clint Capella and Okongwu are solid options at big. Honestly, it would probably be good to free up some more minutes for Okongwu, but they're set there as well. It's really the wing where it's
Yeah.
kind of uncertain. AJ Griffin's probably the guy I'd with the highest upside of those three, just with the shooting and the size that he has. But DeAndre Hunter's showed some in
Hard
the past.
disagree. Hard disagree. I
Are
think
you a
he's probably
Hunter?
my third.
All right. You go on this trio then.
Yeah, I just didn't get a lot of time to watch Jalen Johnson last year, so I don't want to talk out of my ass on him. But I'm still a DeAndre Hunter guy.
Mm-hmm.
I will ride for that number 4 pick in 2019. Injury troubles. He's shown more as a like an isolation scorer than Pat Williams. He hasn't been the defender that Pat Williams has been, I think, so far as a Hawk. But in that bag of like unfulfilled, really toolsy wings, young wings, like Hunter is one of my favorites. And I almost like the fact that he's making 20 million a year now, because it makes me think like a team could steal him.
Mm-hmm.
Because that contract is hard to maintain around Trey and DeJounte and Capella and everyone they're paying over there.
Yeah.
So I had DeAndre as my swing guy
Okay.
because I think a foolish team would sell low.
Mm-hmm.
I think forget the contract. It doesn't look great for his stats right now. I still think he has a really high ceiling. And like he's the kind of player that you want next to Trey. You know, if Trey is the point guard version of a Dirk 2011, construct, you have a superstar offensive virtuoso who needs all the athleticism and defense around him. Who are you trading DeAndre Hunter to get? You're trading him to get someone similar, if you
Yeah.
want to win.
Yeah.
So I would be holding on to that guy and at least rehabilitate his trade value a little bit. And if he and I would love to see him average 20 this year. I don't know if he can do it. He averaged 15 last year, but just give the man some chances to score and also give him a chance to show that he can make guys better, which is really hard to do when Trey is standing on the perimeter waiting to get the ball back.
Yeah. There's not a lot of usage to go around on that team. That's for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on to Miami, who actually finished ahead of Atlanta in the standings, but then lost the play-in game to Atlanta somehow. I said their scouting department. They lost some of their undrafted gems this offseason, sort of in the pursuit of Dame. They kind of let a lot of their fringe guys go, which people have sort of glossed over because they assume they're getting Lillard. And if they do, then that makes up for it. But if they don't, then they kind of have to paper over losing Strus and Vincent, who were both really key contributors for them throughout their playoff run. Now, over the years, they've been kind of a factory for undrafted gems and kind of finding needles in the haystack of fringe NBA players. So can they do that again, or are they going to miss those contributors? Because if they don't trade for Dame, they're trotting out a starting lineup of Lowry, Hero, Jimmy Butler, Kevin Love, and Bam, with a bench of like Duncan Robinson, Highsmith, Orlando Robinson, Jaquez, Jovic, Josh Richardson. Like it's certainly not names that jump off the page. So if they somehow don't end up getting Dame, which, every day that passes, it feels like it's maybe Portland's just going to dig in and not trade him for less than he's worth. I do think that their roster is significantly worse than it was last year.
Yeah. Has Nikola Jovic was a rookie last year. I was like,
Yeah.
has he sneakily played 2 years and done nothing yet? And we're still talking like a trade piece. Zahn and Musa 2.0. Nets know what I'm talking about. But yeah, I'm with you. That makes sense. Even though obviously I didn't also say the Heat scouting department. Um, Bam could take another step. That's all I'm gonna say.
Hmm.
He gets every time we think we know who Bam is, or we think he's a tiny bit disappointing. Every time we pigeonhole that guy, he comes back and he's a little bit better in the playoffs.
Mhm.
And I'm just not taking this last playoff run for granted with him. I'm putting him above Embiid in my player rankings going into this season. And I guess that's kind of cruel to him because I don't know how he gets much higher than that. He's not going to leapfrog like some bona fide superstars, but he has to be above Embiid in the center category.
Wow.
I think that there's just a chance that Bam becomes their best player. Maybe this is the year that the beating gets to Jimmy Butler a little bit, and Bam's era. The baton is passed. He's 26. He hasn't learned to shoot threes yet. That's fine. It might be better for his game if he never does. Maybe until he's in his 30s. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not writing off another Bam step, is what I'm trying to say.
Fair. I'd like to put it on the record that I would still like Embiid over Bam, but I do get where you're coming from with the playoff performance because, frankly, it hasn't. I mean, I guess it's been close, but Bam's
And
certainly been better.
I don't mean to shit on Embiid. I just think like Bam was a grown man in every series. Like he just showed up.
Yeah.
Like how can you can't feel much better about Jaylen Brown than Bam just as like a playoff shower upper.
Yeah. All right. Moving on to Brooklyn, who will, I think, probably not be a playoff team next year, but you never know. Again, this is one of those teams where it's just kind of a hodgepodge, similar to the Bulls. Like I I like Bridges, I like Claxton, I like Cam Johnson, Finney Smith, but I just kind of don't understand what the plan here is. So I picked Sean Marks. Um, are
There are a lot of cop outs in a row. It's making your decision and making it sound a little bit more simplistic. But
yeah,
I'm with you. Go.
this is the last GM I'll pick. But I just don't really understand what the plan is. Like, are they competing for the 9 seed? Are they selling off Cam Johnson and DFS for picks? They can't really tank because they have a lot of their own picks out the window, but they can at least try to gather some assets. So I guess really this year they just kind of have to figure out who the keepers are. Like seems like McHale and Claxton are for sure, but then what? Like, is Cam Thomas anything more than just a microwave scorer off the bench? Can you get anything more out of Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith, or do you want to look to move them? They're rookies, Dariq Whitehead and Noah Clowney. Are they going to be useful for them at all? They just kind of feel like they need to pick a path, and Sean Marks the person responsible for that. So that's what I went with.
Yeah. I went Claxton because I think he still has room to grow. Like the point guard Clax that we saw at Georgia. Maybe this is the year that he taps into a little bit more playmaking, takes his game to another level with an off season to be kind of trained mentally and physically as their second or third best player. I love Clax. And he was somewhere between 50 and 60% from the free throw line in the regular season and playoffs. I think he's effective enough in so many ways that like that's okay.
Yeah.
There's still gonna be some hack of Clax in the playoffs, but he's not shooting 45%. This isn't a Ben Simmons situation. And yeah, I think the Nets would be foolish to offload Claxton and rebuild just for the sake of rebuilding. He's 24, and yeah, I think Claxton has untapped potential just because of his physical gifts and his comfortability on the ball.
When you said this isn't a Ben Simmons situation, I suddenly remembered that Ben Simmons is on the Brooklyn Nets. And he would also, I guess, be a viable pick for this exercise, but I'm kind of just in believe it when I see it mode with him.
No, but I am really speaking of Ben Simmons. I am loving this like expansion draft buzz.
Yeah.
He's gonna be like playing for LeBron's Vegas franchise or something in a couple of years.
Yeah. All right. Moving on to the New York Knicks. Honorable mention for Emmanuel quickly because he had such a good year last year in the regular season and his impact metrics are really strong, some of the best on the team. And in the playoffs, he was not very good. So if they want to raise their ceiling, I think him improving is a big avenue for that. But I still had to go with RJ Barrett. He was great in the playoffs last year. He was probably their second best player, or either him or Mitchell Robinson was their second best player in the playoffs last year. Uh, and that was after a pretty up and down regular season. And then once he sort of turned it on, became their second most consistent offensive player in the playoffs. That was honestly a surprise as a Knicks fan. But he needs to continue making strides finishing around the basket. He's flashed some of that stuff on the World Cup stage. So we'll see if he can bring it into the season next year. He looks like he's gotten a little bit stronger even. And then he needs the jumper to be more consistent. Those are kind of the two things because he gets to the rim a ton, but is among the worst finishers in the league when he gets there, which for his size, he just has to figure out ways to be more effective at the rim. And then if he can just settle in as like a 38% 3-point shooter and not go on these crazy runs where like for a month he's shooting 44% from three, and then for another month he's shooting 20. Like if he can just settle in as a consistent mid to high 30s 3-point shooter, that would be nice. And then figure out the in-between game, because if he can be kind of a consistent weapon for them like he was in the playoffs and they get some development from the rest of the team, maybe Julius Randle actually like figures out how to play in the playoffs for once, then we're really talking about raising the ceiling of this team so it's not just all on Brunson.
Yep. Um, RJ turned 23 a couple months ago. There's still a lot of time for him to take steps. Hopefully, yeah, he's taking a ton of confidence from the way he showed up last year in the postseason. Quick shout for Dante DiVincenzo. I
Mm-hmm.
love him so much. I think he has a chance to be this year's Josh Hart, the way Josh Hart became a Knick and quickly established himself as a must play and closing minutes guy. I don't know. DiVincenzo might be more poor man's Hart
Yeah.
because you guys are more stocked now on the depth chart, but I love DiVincenzo. And I think that there's a good chance that, when RJ's a little bit more inconsistent, when Grimes isn't hitting threes, which is rare, but like whatever. Just DiVincenzo is a guy who could steal Tibbs's because of his two-way effort and his lack of a weakness.
Yeah. No, that's true. Him and Grimes will probably be a battle for minutes at the two all year as well. I'm very excited to
Yeah.
see what Grimes looks like this year too. Side note.
DiVincenzo is just a guy that I watch no matter what team he's on, no matter how many minutes he's getting. And I think like it'd be really, really hard for me to keep him off the floor if I were coaching his team.
All right. Moving on to Cleveland. I think they have a chance to be better next year. I think they probably will be better with filling in Strus and Niang to plug into that fifth spot. Just into that Knicks series just became such a liability, whether they were trotting out Osman or Levert or Okoro. Just they couldn't figure out that fifth spot in the starting lineup. But it's got to be Evan Mobley once again. 2021 draft coming up, and offensively, we saw in the playoffs the Mobley Allen fit is tough. Defensively, it led them to have, I think, the best defensive rating in the league last year with those sort of dual rim protectors. But Mobley kind of needs to make strides either as a shooter or a scorer or something on offense to smooth out that process. And it's kind of their future is a little bit all riding on him. He's kind of the piece that can turn them from like a first or second round playoff team into a real championship contender if he hits his ceiling. And if he doesn't and he sort of stagnates, then they're kind of in a situation where they might be looking at Donovan Mitchell leaving in a couple of years. So he is kind of the key to everything. I think they also have to figure out whether he's a 4 or a 5 at some point, but this is just going to be a very key season for him. He's shown a ton of ability defensively already. He's probably proved the most out of everyone in that 2021 draft class to this point, but still, I think has more to prove, especially offensively, to see if he can kind of reach that all-star forward level.
Yeah, for me, it's Mitchell. What's next for Donovan Mitchell? I've had his back on this podcast, and he hurt my feelings. 2 straight no-shows. Last year was a James Harden style no-show where like he dominated really early in the series and then disappeared. Um, he's not CJ McCollum with better PR. That was the headline a couple of years ago. CJ McCollum never had this ceiling, but he might be James Harden with better PR.
Mm.
And I just want to see what's next for Donovan Mitchell because he was the belle of the ball all year, and then he lost a series his roster had no business losing.
Yeah.
And because of what Jalen Brunson did to Mitchell's Jazz 2 years ago, and what the Knicks did to Mitchell's Cavs this past year, I'm just fascinated to see like what's the next act for this guy. Is there any emotional bounce back, or is he now going to recede into like a De'Aaron Fox type category?
Yeah. And it's interesting with Mitchell because as a Knicks fan, I was terrified of him going up against him in that playoff series, and his stats didn't really back it up to like his impact on the game. But the Knicks were just like throwing everything at him. And Garland was also a no-show in a lot of those games. Like, I mean, that Jared Allen meme of like the lights were a little too bright, I guess, like definitely applied to the whole team where they all just really underachieved in that playoff series. So it'll be an interesting year for them because I think the East could be pretty open. Like there's a shot where they could grab the 2 seed and make a run to the conference finals or something. And I'm curious to see if there's sort of enough internal improvement plus the addition of shooters where that happens.
If they meet the Knicks again, he might need a Brunson restraining order. That's all I'm
Okay, so moving on to Philly, they've definitely got a lot of stuff to figure out between the James Harden situation and then if that situation then births a Joel Embiid situation. But for the moment, just taking their roster as it is right now, again, this is a bit of an obvious one, but I feel like it has to be Tyrese Maxey. You could also say Joel Embiid's health because is it possible for him to get through 2 rounds of the playoffs without picking up some sort of injury? Like, kind of like to see that because he's pushing 30. He'll turn 30 during this season and still has not made it to the second round of the playoffs in one piece. But Tyrese Maxey seems like he's hitting a bit of a inflection point in his career. He's coming up on a new contract. And, is he gonna, there's been a lot of Maxey hero debates. Is he going to be more like Hero, or does he have kind of a higher ceiling where he can be something like Tony Parker? Because he does have some similar tendencies to Tony Parker if he can figure out some more of the playmaking style, but just kind of that really fast, shifty guard who can score in the paint really well. But this season, I think we'll sort of tell. He might be forced into more of an on-ball role if they have to get rid of James Harden, or if James Harden renders himself unable to play. But if he can sort of continue to make strides with consistency and playmaking, I think that really raises the ceiling for the Sixers team long term. But he does kind of naturally limit you defensively if he has to play the 2. So I think it is kind of important that he's able to take over some of those reps at the point. But yeah, I'm just kind of curious to see what this season looks like for him because he could be a guy where everyone likes him now, but once he gets that second contract and he's getting paid $30 million a year, he's not as exciting. He sort of falls into the hero pool category, or he could be someone where it's like no brainer, give him the max and he's still very good value.
I do not expect to ever put Maxey in the hero pool category. Not that that's a crazy thing to say. He flashed a lot of defense at Kentucky. I did not expect him to be like a liability in the NBA. And I still think he can tap into his quickness, his length, and be closer to Emmanuel Quickley than Jordan Poole defensively. So yeah, I love Maxey. And there are very few guys that are truly a one-man fast break the way that he already is. I said what's next for Donovan Mitchell, and I want to know what's next for Joel Embiid. I'll leave it at that. You got your MVP and you hit a wall in the playoffs again. And there's nothing else to say. What's next?
Yeah. I saw this thing on Twitter, which was like, who do we treat as way younger than they actually are? And my first thought for that was Embiid, because I feel like we're still kind of, we think about him like he's kind of inching further in the playoffs and like kind of getting his playoff legs underneath him. But like he was drafted in 2014 and he's about to turn 30, as I just said. And he's someone who has proven to break down over time. That's not something you'd expect to get better as he gets into his 30s. So part of the calculus for Philly and figuring out this James Harden situation and whatever comes after that is like Embiid's prime might not be as long, or probably won't be as long as a lot of other superstars' primes are. And they kind of have to get a feel for what the next 3 to 5 years of Embiid are going to look like. I mean, certainly he still seems like he's ascending or in his prime, because last year was as good of a regular season as he's ever had. But he's also someone where it could fall off kind of quickly.
Yep.
All right. Moving on to Boston. Kind of excited to talk about this one. Kristaps
This is
Porzingis.
another what's next. I feel like I just keep saying what's next, but
Okay.
this is another what's next guy for me. And it's Jaylen Brown. We can talk about other guys because this team has so many interesting players to talk about every single season. But what's next for one-handed Jaylen Brown? Are the memes going to get to him? Probably not, because he seems like an incredibly tough dude who just lost some confidence at the wrong time. But he has enough playoff equity that I haven't written him off as like a playoff gamer. I haven't even quite done that with Donovan Mitchell. I'm asking the tough questions, but like, um, arguably Donovan Mitchell and Jaylen Brown have like more special playoff moments than I can recall off rip for Joel Embiid. Like, what has Joel Embiid done in the playoffs?
Yeah.
That tops a Mitchell or a Jaylen moment. So I'm definitely going to give Jaylen some grace, and I think it's still possible. He's the number 2 guy on a title team, and forget the contract. Like that's what he's worth. He's earned that money, even though it's just scary to put that much money into a guy that just had a disappointing playoffs. It's just the way things work, and yeah, I'm really interested to see what the next season is for him, the next playoff specifically, because he's going to get his numbers in the regular season. I think that much is clear.
Yeah. So I picked Porzingis for them. It
Yeah.
was a really interesting trade they made. If he's right and healthy as a two-way force, he does kind of make them nearly unguardable, where on offense they just have five out spacing and they can drive and kick teams to death, like what they look like with the Al Horford lineup. And then on defense, they have additional rim protection. They can play him and Horford together. Probably him and Robert Williams together is a bit of a stretch, but they at least have some flexibility with that. But he's got injury concerns. He's already dealing with plantar fasciitis and is not playing in the FIBA World Cup. He's really had very few healthy seasons since he tore his ACL back in, what was that, 2017 or 18? And then beyond the injury concerns, I also was not super high on the trade because in the sort of Boston flameouts over the last couple of years, I feel like what tends to get to them, or what tends to be their bugaboo, is passing and sort of general intelligence on the team and being more unpredictable, and then toughness. And, last year they just kind of got punked by Miami and out toughed. And the year before, honestly, in the finals, kind of Draymond Green kind of out toughed them. And in getting Porzingis, they sent out both Marcus Smart and Grant Williams, who are probably 2 of the more intelligent and tough players on their team. And Smart, honestly, for, people dog his shot selection and sort of taking bad threes in key moments, but he was probably, him and Derek White were the 2 best passers on their team. And certainly now you're taking the ball out of his hands, you're putting it more in Tatum and Brown's hands, which from a scoring perspective is good, but from a playmaking perspective, both of them are kind of average, or maybe Tatum a little bit above average, Brown average to below average at passing and creating for others. So they kind of pushed a lot of passing and general basketball intelligence and toughness out of the door. They brought in Porzingis, which in a vacuum, in theory, seems like kind of the piece that can make them unguardable and really elite defensively. But to me, I'm just a little bit hesitant on how much that's really going to work out for them.
Yep. I'm with you there. And I'll go on the record. I don't like the Porzingis trade. Today's league, I don't want to trade a really good perimeter defender for a 7-footer who isn't like an elite center.
Mhm.
It just seems like a recipe for losing a trade. And I don't, it's hard for me to imagine them succeeding in the toughest of matchups with Time Lord and KP on the floor. Um, and then there's still Horford there. I don't know. I don't know who Horford's going to be, but I'm going to talk a lot about age on the next team we go with.
All right. Yes. Last but not least are the Milwaukee Bucks. They're in a really interesting spot for a team that just won the championship, what feels like a couple years ago. The obvious choices are Holiday or Middleton. There's some kind of under the radar, Drew Holiday might retire in 2 years things going around, which would not probably be good for their prospects of keeping Giannis long term, especially if this Middleton decline continues and Lopez is kind of really up there in age.
And the Knicks give a max to Thanasis.
Exactly. But yeah, so you could go with either Holiday or Middleton. Less obvious pick, which I wanted to throw in there as well, is Malik Beasley, who they scooped up for really cheap. He's always like kind of the NBA Twitter nerds darling, is someone who gets up a really high volume of threes, and at least before he got to the Lakers, hit them at a pretty good rate. And they said they're going to give him a chance to compete for the starting spot, him and Grayson Allen. If he can regain his shooting confidence, that could give them a really nice weapon, because honestly, they flamed out in the playoffs this year. And every time they've flamed out in the playoffs, it's been because they can't shoot well enough around Giannis. And yeah, that really comes back to one of the first guys I mentioned, Drew Holiday, and he just has to be better in the playoffs. I saw this graphic going around. It was either efficiency or raw scoring, but I think efficiency wise, has been one of the largest droppers from regular season to playoffs over the last several years. And he just has a lot of these like 3 for 14 type games in the playoffs, which at least he plays defense and sort of contributes winning plays, but he was really bad in that Miami series last year. And he wasn't even, I mean, he was trying against Jimmy, but he was getting absolutely torched. So he's got to be better. Middleton's got to be better. I trust Giannis to be there, and the coaching factor will be different, but it has a chance to be kind of like a last dance sort of season for this core. So yeah, I know you were kind of raring to go on this team, so go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the swing for me is just like, does age matter anymore? Or are we just in an era where guys can stay themselves and stretch their primes out into their mid 30s? Because this is where we're at. It's year 11 for Chris Middleton. He's 32. It's year 14 for Drew. He's 33. It's year 15 for Brook Lopez. He's 35 and weighs 285 pounds.
Just had a back surgery.
Yeah. And so like, is it, and they just paid him because they had to. So are they, are one or two of those guys about to really slow down? Or is this just the modern world we live in where guys like Dame and Jimmy are going to be studs deep into their 30s? It's possible. I mean, I just watched like Djokovic still look like the best tennis player on earth, but he's an alien. We've got LeBron, we've got Brady, we've got these goats doing it. But guys in on earth like Brooke, Drew, and Chris, can they do it? Are they going to be the ancillary pieces that Giannis needs, that they were for their title run a couple of years ago? I don't know. And that's what I'm most interested to find out. And that medical team has a lot on their hands this year.
Yeah. Because I mean, if like the worst case scenario this year is like if they flame out, like, I mean, they have to at least get to the conference finals this year just to, if they lose in the first or second round again, like I know Giannis says there's no failure in sports, but that would definitely be a failure. And it pains me to say, because I mean, I love Giannis, and also I love Drew Holiday. Like when Drew Holiday is going, I love watching him play, because when he has the offense going, the defense is just so fun to watch with the way that he can really shut down some of the best players in the league. Like what he did to Devin Booker and Chris Paul, kept switching off between them in the finals a few years ago, was just so impressive. But when he doesn't have it going, like the offense is bad. And honestly, it's possible he's gotten to the point where he's a bit overrated. It's kind of weird where players go through this cycle where they're underrated, and then everyone's like, this guy's the most underrated dude in the league, and then everyone talks about how they're underrated, and then they become a little bit overrated, and it kind of goes the inverse way too with guys who everyone thinks are overrated. But yeah, this is, as far as like this whole season is just like a swing for the Bucks. Like it's really make or break for them, and if it goes badly, it really could be sort of a last dance type of situation.
Yeah. And what kind of toll does it take on Giannis? If those vets we're talking about are still themselves, but you have to rest them during the regular season to get the real Chris Middleton in the playoffs, that's a lot to put on Giannis's back. And especially with the beating he takes, even when he has his best guys around him. So I feel like it reminds me a little bit of the Warriors a couple of years ago. I mentioned Jimmy, Dame, Steph obviously has to be in that conversation of modern superstars that have found a way to stay elite into their early mid 30s. Like, because we grew up, guys like Dwayne Wade just like, hit a wall
Mm-hmm.
at 32 or whatever. He was just a drastically different athlete and producer. Um, but maybe this is like a team that barely makes it to the finish line, but has the talent to do it, which I feel like is kind of what the Warriors were in 2022.
Yeah. And then Giannis also has to be thinking like after he won that title in 21, it was kind of like, okay, this is Giannis's era. Like we were in the LeBron era. Now we're in the Giannis era. Maybe Luka will catch him in a few years. But now Jokic is kind of like after the way that he won that title this year and how he played the last 2 years, where he sort of needed the playoffs to cement, or the finals run to cement, like, no, I really was the best player in the league the last 2 years. You guys just weren't paying enough attention and putting too much emphasis on sort of team success. But now Giannis, if they flame out again this year, he might be looking at like Jokic passing him by and sort of this being the Jokic era instead of the Giannis era. So that, not to get into legacy talk too much, but that's probably something that as a competitive guy weighs on him too.
Yeah. Most superstars don't get an era though.
True.
So the same, it was like when we talked yesterday and I said Scoot probably isn't the best player on the title team.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is probably that none of these guys get an era.
Right.
um, and if I had to bet on one guy kind of like under 28 having an era, I think I'm going Luka.
Yeah.
Even though Giannis already has one and Jokic already has one. Maybe Jokic is a better pick because the Nuggets look set to compete for 5 years. But yeah, I think I'd go Luka.
All right. And with that, we've reached the end of our swingers part 1 and 2. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.